You should see your face right now, my sister Diane smirked, casually twirling the diamond tennis bracelet that once belonged to our mother. Did you really think Uncle Richard would leave everything to someone who couldn't even show up to his funeral? The surgical bandages across my abdomen throbbed as I tried to process her words. 3 days out of a life-saving operation, and I'd returned home to discover I'd lost something else entirely, my birthright. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Caldwell, and until 6 days ago, I thought I understood the meaning of pain. Then I woke up from emergency surgery to find out my uncle had died while I was unconscious. My sister had buried him without me, and according to Diane, I'd been cut out of the will completely. But what my sister didn't know, what no one knew, was that Uncle Richard and I had our own secrets, ones that were about to turn Diane's smug new world upside down. The morning it all began started like any other Tuesday. I was at my desk in the small back office of Horizon Books, the independent bookstore I'd managed for the past 5 years. The store had been my sanctuary since returning to Millfield after college, a quiet haven of paper and possibility tucked between a coffee shop and an artisan bakery on Main Street. Business was steady but never spectacular, exactly how I liked it, predictable, controllable, unlike my family. My phone buzzed with a text from Uncle Richard. Lunch today? Important matters to discuss. I smiled, typing back a quick agreement. These lunch meetings had become our ritual over the past year, ever since he'd been diagnosed with heart failure. As my father's only brother and a lifelong bachelor, Richard Caldwell had always been more like a second father to me than an uncle. His imposing Victorian home on Willow Creek Road had been my refuge during the stormy years of my parents' divorce, and later during my mother's long illness. Diane, my older sister by 3 years, had never shared my closeness with Uncle Richard. She'd been too busy building her real estate empire in the city, returning to Millfield only for major holidays and the occasional Sunday dinner where she'd regale us with stories of her latest luxury listing or high-profile client. Our mother's death 5 years ago had only widened the gap between us. While I'd moved back to help care for Uncle Richard, Diane had sent expensive flower arrangements and brief, professionally worded sympathy cards. I left the bookstore at noon, telling my assistant manager I'd be back in an hour. Uncle Richard was already seated at our usual table at Riverside Cafe when I arrived. His tall frame slightly stooped now, silver hair neatly combed back. He looked tired, the kind of bone-deep weariness that medication could no longer mask. "Becca," he smiled, standing to kiss my cheek. "Always punctual." "Unlike some people in this family," I replied, thinking of Diane's habitual lateness. "Indeed." He waited until I was seated before continuing. "I've had some news from Dr. Winters. Not good, I'm afraid." My stomach tightened. "The treatment isn't working." He shook his head. 6 months, perhaps less. I've made my peace with it." Before I could respond, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "Which brings me to why I wanted to see you today." I stared at the envelope, my appetite suddenly gone. "Uncle Richard, I don't want to talk about what happens after." His blue eyes, so like my father's, held mine steadily. "We must, Becca. I've spent my life planning for contingencies. I won't stop now." The waiter arrived with our usual orders: grilled salmon salad for me, French onion soup and sourdough for Uncle Richard. We waited until he left before continuing. "I've updated my will," Uncle Richard said, his voice low. "Everything is in order, but there are complications I need to prepare for." "What kind of complications?" I asked, poking at my salad without interest. "Your sister." He sighed, stirring his soup absently. "Diane visited last week. First time? In months. She had quite a lot to say about my estate planning." I could imagine. Diane had never hidden her interest in Uncle Richard's considerable assets. The Caldwell family fortune, built by my grandfather's shipping company and multiplied by my uncle's shrewd investments, was substantial. The Victorian alone was worth millions, not to mention the art collection, the summer cottage on Lakes George, and the various investment portfolios. "Let me guess," I said, trying to keep the bitterness from my voice. "She offered to help streamline your affairs?" A small smile crossed his face. "Something like that. She brought her attorney friend, Harrison, I believe. Very polished fellow, very concerned about the tax implications of my current arrangements." I'm sure he was. Martin Harrison was Diane's trusted legal advisor and occasional date, a shark. In an expensive suit who specialized in finding loopholes for wealthy clients. Uncle Richard pushed the envelope toward me. "This contains information about what we might call my official will, the one filed with Palmer and Winters, my longtime attorneys. It's not the complete picture." I looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, my dear, that I've lived long enough to understand that sometimes the obvious path isn't the safest one." He tapped the envelope. "This details the distribution as Diane and the rest of the world will initially understand it. But there's another document, one that supersedes this, legally speaking." My heart began to race. "A second will?" "Executed last month, properly witnessed and filed with a separate firm in Albany. No one in Millfield knows about it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping further. "Not even Palmer and Winters. But why all the secrecy?" Uncle Richard's expression darkened. "Because your sister has gone to extraordinary lengths recently to, shall we say, influence my decisions. The phone calls, the sudden concern for my health care, the legal advice. It all began after my last hospitalization." He shook his head. "Diane has always been ambitious, but there's something different now, something almost desperate." I knew what he meant. Diane's last visit to my bookstore had been strange. Rather than her usual condescending interest in my little business, she'd been distracted, checking her phone constantly, asking oddly specific questions about Uncle Richard's medication schedule and whether he had good days and bad days, mentally. "What's in the real will?" I asked. "That's not for discussion here." He glanced around the half-empty cafe. "There's a key in the envelope. It opens the hidden compartment in my grandfather's sea captain's desk, the one in the library. You remember the trick to it?" I nodded. As children, Diane and I had been fascinated by the antique mahogany desk with its dozens of tiny drawers and secret panels. Uncle Richard had shown me the most concealed compartment during one rainy afternoon when I was 12. Diane had been at a friend's house that day. It had felt special, being the keeper of a family secret. "When the time comes, you'll find everything you need there. But Becca," his hand reached across the table to grasp mine, "you must be careful. Trust no one until you have the document secured. Not Palmer, not anyone from the law firm. Especially not your sister." Something in his tone sent a chill through me. "You're scaring me, Uncle Richard." "I'm sorry for that." His grip tightened momentarily. "But you're stronger than you know. You always have been. The quiet ones usually are." We finished our lunch, with lighter conversation. A new shipment of rare books I'd acquired for the store, a historical biography he'd just finished reading. If anyone had been watching, they would have seen nothing unusual about our meeting. Just an elderly man and his niece enjoying their weekly lunch. Before we parted, he embraced me tightly. "One more thing," he whispered. "The combination to the wall safe behind the portrait of your grandfather in my study. It's your birthday, then your mother's, then the year the family business was founded." I pulled back, searching his face. "Why are you telling me all this now?" His smile was sad. "Because time isn't always as generous as we hope. Be well, my dear. I'll see you Sunday for dinner?" "Of course." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I watched him walk slowly to his car, the distinguished old gentleman who had been my anchor for so long. It was the last time I would see him conscious. 3 days later, at precisely 10:42 a.m., while helping a customer find a rare edition of Dickens, I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my abdomen. By noon, I was in the emergency room. By 3, I was being prepped for surgery to remove an infected appendix that was moments from rupturing. The doctors later told me it was one of the worst cases they'd seen. The infection had spread, leading to complications that kept me heavily sedated for nearly 72 hours. When I finally regained clear consciousness, the hospital room was dim, evening shadows stretching across the sterile white walls. Diane sat in the visitor's chair, scrolling through her phone, not immediately noticing I was awake. "Water," I croaked, my throat raw from the breathing tube they had removed. "Earlier." Diane looked up, startled. "You're awake." She set down her phone and reached for the plastic cup on the bedside table, holding the straw to my lips. About time. The doctors were starting to worry. I took a few sips, each swallow painful. How long was I out? 3 days? Give or take. She returned to her seat, crossing her legs. She was dressed immaculately as always. Designer dress, perfect makeup, not a hair out of place. It made my hospital gown and unwashed hair feel even more pathetic. 3 days? My mind felt foggy still. "What about the bookstore?" Diane waved, her hand dismissively. "Your assistant manager has it under control. Sarah, is it? She's called twice to check on you." "Sam," I corrected. "Her name is Sam." I shifted, wincing at the pain in my abdomen. "Has Uncle Richard been by? He'll be worried." The change in Diane's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. A slight tightening. Around the eyes, a momentary compression of her lips. "About that," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "I'm afraid I have some bad news." The way she said it, clinical, detached, told me everything before she even continued. "Uncle Richard passed away the night after you were admitted. Heart failure, just as the doctors predicted. It was peaceful, according to the hospice nurse." The room seemed to tilt sideways. "No," I whispered. "That's not possible. We just had lunch. He was fine." These things can happen suddenly at his age, especially with his condition. Diane's tone was sympathetic, but something was off, a strange undercurrent I couldn't quite identify. But I struggled to form coherent thoughts through the grief and medication. "The funeral. We need to plan." "It's been handled," Diane interrupted smoothly. "The service was yesterday. Small, dignified, just as he would have wanted." "Yesterday?" My voice rose sharply, sending pain through my chest. "You held his funeral without me?" Diane sighed, as if dealing with a difficult child. "You were unconscious, Becca. The doctors couldn't say when you'd wake up. We couldn't very well postpone, indefinitely." "We? Who's we?" "Martin helped me with the arrangements. And Palmer and Winters, of course. The law firm has been wonderful. So efficient." There was a note of satisfaction in her voice that made my skin crawl. "I should have been there," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "He was like a father to me." "He was like a father to both of us," Diane corrected, though we both knew that wasn't true. "Anyway, there are other matters we'll need to discuss once you're feeling better. The estate, the house, practical considerations." Something in her tone made me think of Uncle Richard's warnings. The envelope, the secret compartment, the hidden will. "Have they read the will yet?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Diane examined her manicure. "Preliminary discussions. Nothing official yet. But Martin has been incredibly helpful in explaining what to expect." "I bet he has," I thought. "And what should I expect?" She finally met my eyes, her expression a masterful blend of sympathy and resignation. "This is hardly the time with you just waking up. We can discuss all the details once you're home." Diane. I struggled to sit up straighter. What did Uncle Richards will say? She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "If you must know now, he left you an annual stipend, enough to maintain that little bookshop of yours. The house, the investments, the art collection, those require more sophisticated management. The bulk of the estate will be overseen by me, with guidance from Palmer and Winters." The room seemed to grow colder. "That doesn't sound like Uncle Richard." Diane stood, smoothing her dress. "People change, Becca, especially when they realize their time is limited." Uncle Richard understood that preserving the family legacy required certain skills, business acumen, financial literacy. She gathered her designer handbag. "I have to go. Conference call with clients in half an hour, but I'll check on you tomorrow. The doctors say you might be released in a few days if the infection markers continue to improve." She leaned down, pressing a cool kiss to my forehead. "Don't worry about anything. It's all being handled." After she left, I lay in the hospital bed, tears streaming down my face. Grief for Uncle Richard mixed with the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. I reached for my phone on the bedside table, wincing at the pull on my IV line. 3 days of missed calls and messages, most from Sam at the bookstore. Nothing from Uncle Richard, of course. A text from Diane sent before I woke up. "We'll stop by hospital later. Meeting with Richard's attorneys this morning. Details to follow." My fingers trembled as I pulled up my recent messages. The last text from Uncle Richard was still there, sent just before our lunch. "Looking forward to our talk." Much to share. I scrolled back further, finding his message from 2 weeks earlier. "Hidden will finalize today. Tell no one until the time is right. The envelope." I needed to find the envelope he'd given me at lunch, and then I needed to get to that desk in the library before Diane emptied the house of everything that mattered. "Ms. Caldwell?" A nurse entered, checking my IV. "How are we feeling?" "When can I leave?" I asked, my voice stronger than I expected. She looked surprised. "That's up to Dr. Matthews, but with the complications you experienced, I'd expect at least 3 more days of observation." 3 days. 3 days during which Diane would be going through Uncle Richard's house, perhaps, already finding and destroying anything that threatened her claim. I needed to act now, but my body betrayed me. Weak, wounded, confined to this hospital bed, while my sister dismantled my last connection to the man who had been my true north for so long. That night, with the hospital quiet around me, I made a plan. I couldn't wait for a proper discharge. By morning, I would find a way out of here, back to my apartment to retrieve the envelope, and then to Uncle Richard's house to uncover the truth he had entrusted to me alone. What I didn't know then was that Diane had already made her own plans. Plans that would make my escape far more complicated than I could have imagined. As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, one thought kept circling. Uncle Richard had known this was coming. He had prepared for it. And somehow, from beyond the grave, he was counting on me to be strong enough to set things right. I only hoped I wouldn't let him down. Morning came with the harsh, fluorescent glare of hospital lighting and the clatter of breakfast trays. I'd slept fitfully, my dreams filled with images of Uncle Richard trying to tell me something important, while Diane stood in the shadows, scissors in hand, cutting away pieces of his words before they could reach me. I woke feeling more exhausted than when I'd fallen asleep, but with newfound determination coursing through my veins. Dr. Matthews arrived during morning rounds, a tall woman with prematurely silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Your infection markers are improving, but you're still running a low-grade fever," she said, reviewing my chart. Another 72 hours of IV antibiotics should resolve it. I can't stay that long, I said, struggling to sit up. My uncle just died. I need to handle arrangements. Her expression softened with practiced sympathy. I'm very sorry for your loss, Ms. Caldwell, but leaving against medical advice with a post-surgical infection could lead to serious complications. I understand the risks, I replied, thinking of much greater risks waiting outside these hospital walls. I'll sign whatever forms you need, Dr. Matthews frowned. At least wait until this evening. Let us give you today's full round of antibiotics. I'll have the discharge paperwork prepared and you can leave first thing tomorrow. It was a compromise I could accept. One more day wouldn't change things. Diane would need time to locate and access all of Uncle Richard's assets anyway. I nodded. My agreement. Already planning my next steps. After the doctor left, I called Sam at the bookstore. I need a favor, I said after assuring her I was on the mend. Can you go to my apartment? The spare key is under the blue flower pot by your door, she finished. I know. What do you need? There's a manila envelope on my desk in the living room. I need you to bring it to me. And Sam? Don't tell anyone you're coming. Not even my sister if she calls the store. There was a pause. Is everything okay, Rebecca? No, I admitted. But it will be. Can you come during your lunch break? I'll be there at noon, she promised. The morning crawled by. I forced myself to eat the bland hospital breakfast, knowing I would need strength for what lay ahead. A physical therapist visited, helping me take a few painful steps around the room. My first time out of bed since the surgery. Each movement sent jolts of pain through my abdomen, but I pushed through it, understanding that tomorrow would demand much more from my injured body. At 11:45, I texted Sam, "Don't come to my room. Meet me in the hospital chapel on the first floor at noon." The night nurse had mentioned the chapel was rarely used except on Sundays when a local minister held services. It would give us privacy away from the nursing station where visitors were, typically announced. Getting down to the first floor was an ordeal that left me sweating and lightheaded. I disconnected my IV, something I'd watched nurses do countless times during my mother's illness, and tucked the pole into the bathroom where it wouldn't be immediately visible from the doorway. Then I wrapped my hospital robe tightly around my gown and made my way slowly down the hall to the service elevator, trying to look like a patient on an approved walk rather than an escaping prisoner. The chapel was empty as I'd hoped, its hushed stillness broken only by the faint sounds of the hospital filtering in from outside. I lowered myself carefully into a pew near the back, breathing through the pain that radiated from my incision site. Sam arrived precisely at noon, her round face creased with worry when she saw me. "You look terrible," she said bluntly, sliding into the pew beside me. At 25, Sam was 5 years younger than me, with a directness I'd always appreciated. "Thanks," I replied dryly. "Do you have it?" She pulled the manila envelope from her messenger bag. "Right where you said it would be. Now, what's going on? You're acting like you're in a spy movie." I took the envelope, my fingers trembling slightly as I confirmed it was still sealed. My uncle left something important for me to find. Something my sister doesn't know about. I need to get to his house before she... I trailed off, not wanting to speak my suspicions aloud. Sam's eyes widened. "Before she what? Rebecca, you're scaring me." "I'm scaring myself," I admitted. "But I can't explain everything now. I need one more favor. Can you pick me up tomorrow morning around 7? I'm checking myself out of the hospital." "That's a terrible idea," she said flatly. "You can barely walk." "I don't have a choice." I clutched the envelope tighter. Uncle Richard trusted me with something important. I can't let him down. Sam studied my face for a long moment before sighing heavily. "Fine. But I'm not just dropping." "You off somewhere?" "I'm staying with you, whatever this is." Relief washed over me. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." She stood, adjusting her bag. "I still think this is crazy." After Sam left, I made my painful way back to my room, relieved to find it still empty. I reconnected my IV with clumsy fingers and collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm me. The envelope felt heavy in my hands as I finally opened it. Inside, just as Uncle Richard had said, was a small brass key taped to a sheet of paper. The paper contained what appeared to be a standard will, stating that the bulk of the Caldwell estate would pass to Diane, with a modest annual stipend set aside for me. It was dated just 3 months ago and bore Uncle Richard's familiar signature. If this had been his only will, Diane's smug certainty would be justified. But there was something else in the envelope. A handwritten note in Uncle Richard's elegant script. Becca, if you're reading this, circumstances have forced my hand sooner than expected. The official will, details enclosed, is merely the first act in our play. Remember your role, appear to accept what's happened until you've secured the second will from the desk. Trust no one from Palmer and Winters. Martin Harrison has been in your sister's confidence for years. Their relationship extends beyond professional boundaries. The safe contains additional evidence you'll need. Diane has been systematically redirecting my investments for the past year, small amounts that wouldn't raise alarms individually, but substantial in aggregate. Nearly $3 million diverted through a shell company called Lakeside Holdings. Harrison created the legal framework, but Diane is the sole beneficiary. I've known for months but played along to gather evidence. The second will nullifies everything, but timing is critical. You'll know when to reveal it. You are stronger than you believe, Becca. You always have been. With love and faith, Uncle Richard, I stared at the note, my hands shaking. Embezzlement. My sister had been stealing from our dying uncle, and he had known. Had been building a case against her. And now he was gone. And I was all that stood between Diane and her final victory. The rest of the day passed in a haze of nursing checks, medication, and fitful sleep. Diane didn't visit, texting instead that she was tied up with estate matters and would see me tomorrow. Each hour brought a clearer understanding of what I had to do and how difficult it would be in my current condition. By evening, my fever had broken. Dr. Matthews seemed pleased with my progress during her final rounds, though she still recommended against discharge. At least wait until the afternoon, she urged. Give the antibiotics one more cycle. I nodded agreeably, already knowing I would be gone before she arrived in the morning. At 6 the next morning, I was dressed in the clothes Sam had brought. Me, sitting on the edge of the bed as a nursing assistant, took my final vitals. Blood pressure's still a little high, she commented. Probably from being up and moving around. Or from planning to confront a sister who had likely committed multiple felonies, I thought. By 6:45, I had signed all the AMA against medical advice forms, received my prescriptions, and had my IV removed. The discharge nurse looked disapproving, but couldn't legally stop me. You should have someone staying with you, she reminded me for the third time. Those antibiotics can cause dizziness, and you'll need help changing the surgical dressing. My sister will be checking on me, I lied smoothly. Sam was waiting in the hospital's circular drive when I emerged into the crisp autumn morning. The effort of walking from my room to the exit had left me lightheaded and nauseated, but I forced a smile as I eased carefully into her battered Subaru. You still look terrible, she greeted me, handing over a takeout coffee cup. But less corpse-like than yesterday. Your bedside manner needs work, I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. The warmth of the cup felt reassuring in my cold hands. Where to? Sam asked as she pulled away from the hospital. Your apartment? I shook my head. Uncle Richard's house. We need to get there before Diane arrives. As we drove through Millfield's quiet morning streets, I filled Sam in on the basics. Uncle Richard's secret second will, Diane's apparent embezzlement, the proof hidden in the antique desk. I left out the extent of the fortune at stake, not wanting to overwhelm her with the magnitude of what we were attempting. So your sister basically took advantage of your burst appendix to stake her claim to everything, Sam summarized as we turned onto Willow Creek Road. That's cold, even for Diane. She's always been ruthlessly pragmatic, I said, feeling a strange mix of anger and sadness. But I never thought she'd go this far. Uncle Richard's Victorian came into view, its 3 stories of gingerbread trim and slate blue clapboard standing proudly amid ancient oak trees. The morning sun cast long shadows across the circular drive, where a sleek black BMW was already parked. My stomach dropped. That's Martin Harrison's car. They're already here. Sam pulled over half a block from the house. Now what? We can't exactly waltz in if they're inside. I closed my eyes, thinking. The sunroom at the back. Uncle Richard never locked it. Said, he liked to imagine wildlife wandering in for a visit. It connects to the kitchen, then the main hall. And your sister and her lawyer boyfriend won't notice us sneaking through the house? The place is huge, over 30 rooms, and the library is on the 2nd floor, east wing. If they're in the study going through papers, we might be able to get in and out without them noticing. Sam looked dubious. This is officially the dumbest thing I've ever done, she muttered, but put the car in drive and circled around to the service road that ran behind the property. We parked near the gardener's shed and approached the house. Through the sprawling gardens, now slightly overgrown since Uncle Richard had reduced the groundskeeping staff as his health declined. The effort of walking even this short distance left me breathless and damp with sweat, the surgical wound pulsing with each step. The sunroom door opened silently, just as I'd predicted. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of orchids and jasmine from Uncle Richard's prized collection of tropical plants. We paused, listening. From somewhere deep in the house came the murmur of voices, too distant to distinguish words, but clear enough to locate. The study, just as I'd guessed. This way, I whispered, leading Sam through the kitchen and into the grand hallway with its sweeping staircase. Each step sent fire through my abdomen, but I gritted my teeth and kept moving. The voices grew marginally, louder as we passed the study door on our way to the stairs. Diane's crisp tones interspersed with Harrison's deeper rumble. What about the books? I heard Diane ask as we crept by. The first editions alone must be worth. We didn't linger to hear Harrison's response, continuing our slow ascent of the stairs. By the time we reached the 2nd floor landing, I was trembling with exertion, spots dancing before my eyes. I need a minute, I gasped, leaning against the wall. Sam looked alarmed. You're white as a sheet. We should go back. I shook my head, breathing slowly through the pain. We're almost there. The library was exactly as I remembered. A grand room lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves, leather armchairs arranged around a massive stone fireplace, and in the corner near the bay window, Grandfather Caldwell's sea captain's desk. It stood like a sentinel, its rich mahogany surface gleaming in the morning light, filtering through velvet curtains. I moved to it reverently, running my fingers along its edges before locating the hidden latch beneath the right-hand drawer. There was a faint click, and a panel in the back slid aside, revealing a small compartment. Inside lay a sealed red leather portfolio, embossed with the Caldwell family crest. My hand shook as I withdrew it. This is it. Just then, footsteps sounded in the hallway, brisk, purposeful steps I recognized instantly. Diane. Someone's here, we heard her say sharply. The alarm system logged motion in the upstairs east wing. Sam looked panicked. What do we do? My mind raced. There was no way I could move quickly enough to escape. Not in my condition. You go, I whispered urgently. Take the servants' stairs at the end of the hall. I'll create a distraction. I'm not leaving you. You have to. I pressed the portfolio into her hands. Get this somewhere safe. It's everything Uncle Richard gathered against them. The second will, the evidence of embezzlement, all of it. Sam hesitated, then nodded, clutching the portfolio to her chest. Where should I go? The bookstore. Wait for me there. I gave her a gentle push toward the door. Hurry! As Sam slipped out, I moved to the center of the library, lowering myself into one of the leather chairs just as Diane appeared in the doorway, Martin Harrison looming behind her. Well, I said calmly, though my heart was hammering. Good morning, Diane. I see you've made yourself at home. Diane's perfectly composed face registered shock, then fury. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in the hospital. I checked. Myself out, I replied, forcing a casual tone despite the pain radiating through my body. Thought I'd start going through Uncle Richard's books. He always said I should have them when he was gone. Martin Harrison stepped forward, his tall frame imposing in his tailored suit. That's not your decision to make, Rebecca. As the executor of Richard's estate, Diane has full authority over the disposition of all assets, including the library. Contents. Is that so? I raised an eyebrow, channeling Uncle Richard's calm authority. How interesting. Diane's eyes narrowed suspiciously. What are you really doing here, Becca? And don't say it's about books. Memories, I said softly, letting genuine grief color my voice. I wasn't at his funeral thanks to you. I needed to feel close to him. Is that so hard to understand? Something flickered in Diane's expression, not quite guilt, but perhaps discomfort. You were unconscious. What was I supposed to do? Wait, I suggested. Show basic human decency? But then, that's never been your strong suit, has it? Harrison cleared his throat. This family argument is unproductive. Rebecca, now that you're here, perhaps we should discuss the terms of your uncle's will. The stipend arrangements will need to be— Actually, I interrupted. I was hoping to speak with someone from Palmer and Winters, Uncle Richard's actual attorneys, not my sister's friend. I put just enough emphasis on the last word to make Harrison's jaw tighten. Palmer and Winters have been fully apprised of the situation, Diane said stiffly. Martin is handling the transition of assets. How convenient for you both. I shifted in the chair, unable to completely hide a wince of pain. Diane noticed. You shouldn't be out of the hospital. You look awful. Your concern is touching. This isn't concern, it's practicality. If you collapse here, it creates complications. I laughed, a short, harsh sound that hurt my incision. Heaven forbid anything complicate your plans, Diane. Harrison placed a restraining hand on Diane's arm as she started to retort. Perhaps we should all take a step back, he suggested smoothly. Rebecca is clearly still recovering, and emotions are running high. Why don't we schedule a formal meeting later this week? Once everyone has had time to process their grief, the patronizing tone made my blood boil, but I maintained my composure. Uncle Richard's note echoed in my mind. Timing is critical. You'll know when to reveal it. Not yet. Not until I had the portfolio safely in my possession and had reviewed its contents. Fine, I agreed. But I'd like Palmer to be present. Uncle Richard always spoke highly of them. Of course, Harrison agreed too readily. Though as the will is quite straightforward, their presence is largely a formality. I noted the slight emphasis on straightforward with interest, so they believed the official will was all there was. Good. Diane was watching me with that same suspicious look. How did you get here? You can't drive in your condition. Sam dropped me off, I said truthfully. She'll be back for me later. That weird girl from your bookstore? Diane wrinkled her nose. Really, Becca, you could do better for friends. I didn't rise to the bait. I'd like some time alone here if you don't mind, to say my goodbyes properly. Diane exchanged a glance with Harrison. We were just finishing up in the study, she said finally. We'll be leaving shortly. Try not to disturb anything important. The warning in her tone was unmistakable. I wouldn't dream of it, I replied evenly. After they left, I allowed myself to collapse back against the chair, exhaustion and pain washing over me in waves. I'd bought some time, but not much. Diane's suspicions had been roused, and Harrison was clearly eager to finalize their control of the estate before any complications arose. I pulled out my phone to text Sam. "Did you get out okay?" The reply came seconds later. "Yes. At the store, now with the package." "What happened?" "Confronted D&H. They're suspicious but don't know what we found. Coming to you soon." I tucked the phone away and forced myself to stand, swaying slightly as dizziness swept over me. There was one more thing I needed before leaving: the contents of the wall safe in Uncle Richard's study. The evidence he'd mentioned would be crucial if Harrison tried to challenge the second will.
Making my way downstairs was even more arduous than going up had been. Each step sent jolts of pain through my body, and by the time I reached the first floor, I could feel dampness seeping through my shirt where the surgical dressing covered my incision. Not good. Voices drifted from the front of the house, Diane and Harrison preparing to leave. I pressed myself against the wall in the hallway, waiting until I heard the front door close and the sound of a car engine starting before continuing. To the study. Uncle Richard's private sanctuary was a smaller, more intimate version of the library, dark wood paneling, a massive desk positioned to view the gardens through French doors, and walls adorned with family portraits. The painting of my grandfather, stern in his shipping company uniform, hung behind the desk, concealing the wall safe just as Uncle Richard had described. I carefully removed the painting and faced the small safe embedded in the wall. My birthday, 06-12. My mother's birthday, 0903. The year the family business was founded, 1887. I rotated the dial carefully, 06-12-0903, 1887. And felt a surge of triumph when the handle turned, the door swinging open. Inside was a thick accordion, file labeled simply "Proof" in Uncle Richard's handwriting, along with a small velvet pouch. I removed both, opening the pouch to find my grandmother's sapphire pendant and matching earrings, pieces I'd always loved, which Diane had repeatedly told Uncle Richard should go to her as the eldest. Tucking both items into my bag, I replaced the painting and made my slow, painful way out of the house the same way we'd entered. The garden path seemed twice as long now, each step an exercise in endurance. By the time I reached Sam's car, hidden behind the gardener's shed, black spots were dancing at the edges of my vision. "You look even worse," Sam observed as I all but fell into the passenger seat. "Hospital?" "Bookstore," I insisted. "We need to see what's in that portfolio." As we drove away, I glanced back at the grand old Victorian that had been my second home. For so long, Diane's BMW was gone from the circular drive, but I knew she wouldn't remain away for long. The game had changed, and she would sense it, like a predator detecting a shift in the wind. The real battle was just beginning, and I would need every ounce of strength Uncle Richard believed I possessed to win it. But for the first time since, waking in that hospital room to news of his death, I felt a flicker of hope. Uncle Richard had prepared carefully, methodically, as he did everything in life. He wouldn't have left me this task if he didn't believe I could complete it. I closed my eyes as Sam drove, one hand pressed against my throbbing incision, the other clutching my bag with its precious contents. Whatever came next, I was no longer merely reacting to Diane's machinations. I had what Uncle Richard had entrusted to me, the truth and the means to reveal it. The question now was, when and how would I make my move? The back room of Horizon Books had never felt so much like a war room. Sam had closed the shop early, flipping the "sorry we're closed" sign and drawing the blinds while I spread the contents of Uncle Richard's portfolio across the antique farmhouse table we normally used for book club meetings. My hands trembled as I carefully removed each document, arranging them in chronological order as Uncle Richard had taught me to do with any important paperwork. Holy hell! Sam whispered, staring at the bank statements laid out before us. "Your sister really did steal from your uncle." The evidence was undeniable. A meticulously documented trail of wire transfers from Uncle Richard's investment accounts to Lakeside Holdings, LLC. Each transaction was modest enough to avoid immediate suspicion, 15,000 here, 20,000 there. But over 18 months, they totaled nearly $3 million. Uncle Richard had highlighted each transfer and added his own notes in the margins, tracking how Diane had gradually escalated from small diversions to increasingly larger sums as his health deteriorated. Most damning of all were printouts of emails between Diane and Martin Harrison, discussing how to structure the transactions to avoid triggering alerts at the bank or with Uncle Richard's financial advisors. In one particularly incriminating exchange dated just 2 months ago, Harrison had written, "Once R signs the revised will, all of this becomes moot anyway. The shuffling of assets will appear legitimate in retrospect. Just maintain the status." Until then, Diane's reply had chilled me. "He's becoming more suspicious, asking too many questions about the Lakeside transfers. We may need to accelerate our timeline." "Your sister was planning this for over a year," Sam said, reading over my shoulder. "And that lawyer was helping her every step of the way." "They were counting on Uncle Richard being too ill to notice," I replied, fighting a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with my surgical wound. "They underestimated him. The most important document lay in a separate sealed envelope marked Last Will and Testament of Richard Caldwell, with yesterday's date, just a week after our final lunch. I broke the seal with shaking fingers and withdrew the thick legal document, its pages crisp and official, with the letterhead of Blackwood and Associates, a prestigious Albany law firm. Unlike the simplified will Uncle Richard had shown me at lunch, this document spelled out his wishes in exacting detail. The Caldwell estate, the Victorian home, the summer cottage, the extensive investment portfolio, and the family art collection was to be placed in a trust, with me named as the primary trustee. Diane would receive a modest annual income, contingent upon her completion of a financial management program and ongoing counseling. Most significant was a section titled Evidence of Malfeasance, which explicitly detailed Diane's embezzlement and directed the trustees to cooperate with authorities in pursuing criminal charges if necessary. Uncle Richard had left nothing to chance. He knew exactly what she was doing, I said softly. All this time, he was building a case against her. But why wait? Why not confront her while he was still alive? Sam asked, perplexed. I thought about it for a moment, because he wanted to give her a chance to stop on her own, to make the right choice. It was exactly like Uncle Richard, stern but fair, always believing people could change until they proved otherwise. The second will also included a personal letter addressed to me, separate from the note he'd left. In the manila envelope, I unfolded it carefully, recognizing his distinctive handwriting. My dear Becca, by now you've discovered the full extent of Diane's betrayal. I wish I could have spared you this burden. But there was no one else I could trust. Your sister's actions stem from a desperation I failed to recognize until it was too late. A hollowness she's tried to fill with status and wealth since she was a child. I don't ask you to forgive her. That must be your own choice. But I do ask that you consider the provisions I've made for her rehabilitation rather than imprisonment. Justice need not always wear handcuffs to be effective. The legal team at Blackwood and Associates is expecting your call. They will guide you. Through the process of contesting the fraudulent will Diane has surely submitted by now. Timing will be critical. Too soon, and she may destroy evidence. Too late, and assets may be irretrievably lost. Trust your instincts. Becca, you've always seen more clearly than you give yourself credit for, with loving faith in your judgment. Uncle Richard, I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the comfort of Uncle Richard's confidence in me. He'd trusted me to make the right decisions, not just follow a rigid plan. "What now?" Sam asked, gathering the documents and returning them to the portfolio. "Do we call the police?" I shook my head, wincing as a sharp pain reminded me of my still healing body. "Not yet. Blackwood and Associates first. We need to make sure the legal groundwork is solid before making any moves that might spook Diane." The call to the Albany law firm was brief but reassuring. Mr. Blackwood himself, a contemporary of Uncle Richard's with a voice like aged bourbon, confirmed that they had been fully briefed on the situation and were ready to move forward on my instructions. Richard was quite clear about the circumstances, he said. "We've already prepared the necessary filings to contest the fraudulent will. How quickly can we move?" I asked, keenly aware that Diane would be using every hour to consolidate her control over Uncle Richard's assets. "We can file first thing tomorrow morning," Blackwood replied. "But Richard was explicit about wanting you present when we confront. Your sister and Mr. Harrison, are you well enough to travel to Millfield for a meeting?" I thought of my weakened body, the wound that still throbbed with every movement, the antibiotics that left me dizzy and nauseated. "I'll be there," I said firmly. After arranging to meet Blackwood and his associate at their satellite office in Millfield the following afternoon, I ended the call and slumped back in my chair, suddenly exhausted. "You need rest," Sam said, eyeing me with concern. "And probably another dose of those antibiotics. You're staying at my place tonight, no arguments." I didn't have the energy to object. While Sam closed up the shop and secured Uncle Richard's documents in the ancient safe beneath the floorboards, I swallowed my medications and tried to gather my remaining strength. Tomorrow would require everything I had and more. Sam's apartment above the local coffee shop was small but cozy, with mismatched furniture and walls covered in vintage movie posters. She made up the sofa bed for me, fussing with extra pillows to help me find a position that didn't aggravate. "My incision. You know this is crazy, right?" she said as she handed me a mug of chamomile tea. "You should be in hospital, not playing Nancy Drew with embezzlement evidence." "Uncle Richard trusted me to handle this," I replied, sipping the tea gratefully. "I won't let him down." "He also would have wanted you to take care of yourself," Sam pointed out. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse." She was right, of course. I'd been pushing myself beyond my physical limits, running on adrenaline and determination. But lying on the sofa bed, listening to the comforting sounds of Sam moving around the small kitchen, I felt the full weight of my exhaustion descend. Within minutes, I was asleep. Morning came with sunlight streaming through Sam's gauzy curtains, and the scent of fresh coffee. I awoke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where I was and why my body ached so terribly. Then it all rushed back. Uncle Richard, Diane, the hidden will, today's meeting. "You look marginally more human," Sam observed, handing me a steaming mug and a toast plate. The wonders of actual sleep. I managed a small smile, accepting both gratefully. "What time is it?" "Just after 9. Your meeting isn't until 2, so you have time to eat, shower, and maybe look less like someone who escaped from a hospital ward." She had a point. If I was going to face Diane and Harrison, I needed to appear stronger than I felt. "Do you have anything I could wear? Something authoritative?" Sam's eclectic wardrobe yielded a simple black dress that was slightly loose on my frame but looked professional enough when belted. She lent me a tailored blazer that helped disguise how much weight I'd lost during my hospital stay. A careful application of makeup concealed the worst of my pallor, and by noon, I looked reasonably put together, even if I still felt fragile as glass. The Millfield satellite office of Blackwood and Associates occupied the top floor of the town's only office building, its reception area decorated with understated elegance, leather chairs, oriental rugs, and discreet lighting that spoke of old money and discretion. Mr. Blackwood rose to greet me as Sam and I entered, his tall frame slightly stooped with age, but still imposing in a perfectly tailored suit. "Miss Caldwell," he said, taking my hand, "Richard spoke of you often and with great admiration. I'm deeply sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I replied, warmed by the genuine respect in his voice. "Uncle Richard mentioned you as well. He valued your counsel." "And your friendship," Blackwood added softly. 40 years, through good times and difficult ones." He gestured to a younger man standing nearby. "This is Daniel Evans, my associate. He's been handling the details of the filing." Evans shook my hand with a firm grip. "We're well prepared, Miss Caldwell. The documentation your uncle provided is extremely thorough." "Has my sister arrived yet?" I asked, glancing toward the conference room visible through glass doors. "Not yet. We told her the meeting was to finalize transfer of the estate under the first will," Blackwood explained. "She believes this is merely a formality." "And Palmer and Winters, Uncle Richard's local attorneys. They'll be joining us as well. They were unaware of the second will, but have cooperated fully since we contacted them this morning. It appears they were misled by Harrison rather than complicit in any wrongdoing." A familiar voice from the reception area made me turn. Diane had arrived, Martin Harrison at her side, like a well-dressed shadow. My sister looked immaculate as always, in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her dark hair swept into a perfect chignon. The only sign of stress was the slight tightness around her eyes as she spotted me across the room. "Becca," she said with evident surprise. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied evenly. Harrison stepped forward, extending his hand to Blackwood with practiced smoothness. "Martin Harrison, representing Diane Caldwell. I don't believe we've had the pleasure." "Edward Blackwood," came the cool reply, with no hand offered in return. "Richard Caldwell's personal attorney for several decades." Harrison's smile faltered slightly. "I was given to understand Palmer and Winters handled all of Richard's legal affairs." "Evidently not all," Blackwood said, his tone pleasant but firm. "Shall we proceed to the conference room? I believe the Palmer and Winters representatives have just arrived." The conference room was large enough to feel spacious without losing intimacy, dominated by a gleaming mahogany table that reminded me of furniture in Uncle Richard's study. Diane took a seat near the head of the table, Harrison beside her, while I chose a spot directly across from them, Sam settling into the chair next to mine. Blackwood and Evans arranged themselves at the head of the table with the two attorneys. From Palmer and Winters, a senior partner and a younger associate, completing our circle. Diane's gaze kept flicking from me to Blackwood, her perfect composure beginning to show cracks of uncertainty. "I was under the impression this meeting was to finalize the transfer of assets," she said, a slight edge in her voice. "I wasn't aware it required such a crowd." "Ms. Caldwell," Blackwood began, addressing Diane with formal politeness, "we've called this meeting to address a matter of significant legal importance regarding your uncle's estate." He opened a leather portfolio, different from the one Uncle Richard had left for me, and removed a thick document bearing an official seal. "This is the last will and testament of Richard Caldwell, executed on October 15th of this year, superseding all previous versions." Harrison leaned forward, frowning. "That's not possible. We have the most recent will filed with Palmer and Winters just 3 months ago." "I'm afraid Mr. Blackwood is correct," the senior partner from Palmer and Winters said, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Our firm was contacted this morning with documentation confirming the existence of a more recent will. We've verified its authenticity." Diane's face had gone very still, a stillness I recognized from childhood. The calm before an explosive storm. "What exactly are you saying?" she asked, her voice dangerously soft. Blackwood slid the will across the table. "I'm saying, Miss Caldwell, that the will you've been proceeding with is no longer valid. This document reflects your uncle's true final wishes. As Diane reached for the document, I caught her eye across the table. In that moment, something passed between us, a flash of recognition, of understanding. She knew. Perhaps she had always known, somewhere beneath the layers of justification and entitlement, that Uncle Richard would not let her actions stand unchallenged. Harrison was already flipping through the pages, his face darkening as he absorbed the contents. When he looked up, his expression was murderous. "This is preposterous. Obviously forged. Richard Caldwell was ill, heavily medicated. He was terminally ill, but fully competent." Blackwood cut in smoothly. "As attested by 2 physicians and a court-appointed psychiatrist, who evaluated him specifically for testamentary capacity. The documentation is included in Appendix C." Diane hadn't spoken, her eyes still locked on mine as the ground shifted beneath her carefully constructed plans. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What else do you know? What else do you know?" Diane's question hung in the air between us, the conference room suddenly thick with tension. Despite the crowd of lawyers surrounding us, this moment felt intensely personal. A confrontation years in the making between 2 sisters who had grown into strangers. "Everything," I replied quietly, nodding to Evans, who slid the accordion. File marked proof across the polished mahogany. Uncle Richard documented it all. Diane didn't reach for the file. Her perfectly manicured hands remained flat on the table, though I noticed a slight tremor in her fingers. "You weren't supposed to find that, clearly," I said, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from my voice. "Just like I wasn't supposed to wake up in time for the funeral, or recover quickly enough to question the will. Convenient timing, wasn't it?" Harrison placed a warning hand on Diane's arm. "I advise against continuing this conversation," he said sharply. "These accusations are baseless and potentially slanderous." "Actually," Blackwood interjected, opening the accordion file and methodically arranging bank statements across the table, "they're meticulously documented. 18 months of systematic embezzlement from Richard Caldwell's accounts to Lakeside Holdings, LLC. He turned to the Palmer and Winters partners, whose expressions had grown increasingly grave. "A company created by your firm at Mr. Harrison's request, I believe." The senior partner from Palmer and Winters looked stricken. "We had no knowledge of any impropriety. The paperwork came through Harrison's office with Richard's signature." "Forged," I said. "Uncle Richard kept samples of the forgeries. They're quite good, but the pressure points are wrong. He always pressed harder on downstrokes. Harrison's facade of professional confidence was crumbling by the second. This is absurd. Even if there were transfers, which I'm not conceding, Richard authorized them. Investment diversification was a standard part of our financial planning discussions." Evans silently placed printouts of the email exchanges between Harrison and Diane on the table. "Just maintain the status quo until then," I quoted, watching Harrison's face drain of color as he recognized his own words. "That doesn't sound like authorized transfers to me. It sounds like theft." The Palmer and Winters attorneys were now staring at Harrison with undisguised horror. The firm's reputation in Millfield was built on decades of impeccable ethics. Being associated with embezzlement would be devastating. "We had no knowledge of this," the senior partner repeated, already distancing his firm from the growing scandal. Through it all, Diane remained unnaturally still, her eyes fixed on the damning paper trail spread before her. When she finally looked up at me, I was startled by what I saw in her expression, not defiance or even anger, but something that looked almost like relief. "You don't understand," she said softly, ignoring Harrison's attempt to silence her. "It wasn't supposed to be like this? Enlighten me then," I replied, genuinely curious despite everything. "Explain how stealing from our dying uncle while I was in surgery was supposed to be." Diane's perfect composure, The mask she'd worn for as long as I could remember, cracked completely. Lakeside Investment Properties was going to be my legacy, she said, her voice unsteady. The development that would put me on the map. 20 luxury lakefront homes, each selling for millions. I had the plans, the contractors, everything lined up. All I needed was the capital. So you stole it, I said flatly. I borrowed it, she corrected, a flash of the old defiance returning. The profits would have more than repaid Uncle Richard's investment. He would have thanked me for it. Then why not ask him? Present it as a business proposal. Her laugh was hollow. I did. 3 years ago. He said it was environmentally irresponsible and counter to the Caldwell legacy of conservation. Refused to even look at the financials. So you decided to take matters into your own hands, Blackwood observed, his tone neutral, but his eyes hard, starting with small transfers, then escalating as Mr. Caldwell's health declined. Diane didn't deny it. The opportunity was perfect. Pristine lakefront property, minutes from the city. Do you know how rare that is? But I was losing it. The owner was entertaining other offers. I needed the down payment. And once you started, you couldn't stop, I said, understanding dawning. The initial investment wasn't enough. Construction costs increased, permits were delayed, environmental assessments required modifications. Her words came faster now, as if she'd been waiting to explain, to justify. I just needed a little more time. Once the property sold, everything would have balanced out. Uncle Richard would never have even noticed the money was gone. Harrison had given up trying to silence her, his own survival instincts evidently kicking in as he began, mentally calculating his legal exposure. The Palmer and Winters attorneys were taking furious notes, already preparing their firm's defense. Except he did notice, I said. He was tracking every dollar, Diane, building a case while you thought he was too ill to pay attention. Something like grudging admiration flickered across her face. He was always smarter than people gave him credit for. Smart enough to create a contingency plan, Blackwood said, tapping the second will. This document does more than just redistribute his assets, Ms. Caldwell. It specifically addresses the embezzlement and provides Ms. Rebecca with clear directives regarding potential criminal charges. Harrison's head snapped up at that. Criminal charges! $3 million exceeds the threshold for grand larceny in the first degree, Evans supplied helpfully. Under state law, that carries a potential prison sentence of up to 25 years. The room fell silent as the full implications sank in. My sister, the golden child, the successful businesswoman, the perfectionist, was facing the possibility of prison. Despite everything, I felt a strange hollowness at the thought. It was never supposed to go this far, Diane whispered. More to herself than anyone else. I thought of Uncle Richard's letter, his request that I consider the provisions for rehabilitation rather than imprisonment. Justice need not always wear handcuffs to be effective, he'd written. In that moment, looking at my sister's defeated posture, I understood what he meant. There may be an alternative, I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. Uncle Richard included provisions in his will if you agree to certain conditions. Hope flickered in Diane's eyes, quickly masked by suspicion. What kind of conditions? I nodded to Blackwood, who turned to the relevant section of the will. Full restitution of all diverted funds, resignation from your current real estate position, completion of a financial ethics program, regular counseling sessions, and a 5-year period during which you'll work under supervision at the Caldwell Foundation, focusing specifically on affordable housing initiatives. You're joking, Diane said flatly. I'm supposed to give up my career to build housing for poor people. You're supposed to use your considerable talents to actually help people instead of just helping yourself, I replied, unable to keep the edge from my voice. It's that or face criminal charges. Uncle Richard left the choice to you, but the decision about whether to honor his wishes is mine. Harrison had been whispering urgently with the Palmer and Winters attorneys, no doubt trying to salvage some protection. For himself, now he leaned toward Diane. At minimum, we should negotiate these terms, the restitution amount, the timeline. Shut up, Martin, Diane said wearily, not even looking at him. You've done enough. She turned back to me, really seeing me perhaps for the first time in years. Why would you even consider this? After everything I've done? It was a fair question. Part of me wanted to see her face the full consequences of her actions, to experience just a fraction of the pain and betrayal she'd caused. But another part, the part Uncle Richard had seen and trusted, recognized that continuing the cycle of revenge would only perpetuate our broken relationship. Because it's what Uncle Richard wanted, I said simply. He believed you could change. That underneath all of this, I gestured to the evidence of her crimes spread across the table, was the sister I used to know, the one who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my science projects. Something shifted in Diane's expression, softening around the eyes, a brief glimpse of the girl she'd been before ambition consumed her. I haven't been that person for a long time. Maybe it's time to try again, I suggested quietly. The next hour passed in a blur of legal discussions as the framework for Diane's rehabilitation was established. Harrison, sensing which way the wind was blowing, attempted to distance himself from the scheme, claiming he had merely been following his client's instructions. The cold stares from every attorney in the room suggested his professional reputation and possibly his license hung by a thread. By the time signatures were exchanged on preliminary agreements, my strength was fading rapidly. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving behind waves of pain and exhaustion. Sam noticed immediately, her worried gaze tracking the pallor that I knew was spreading across my face. "We need to wrap this up," she said firmly. "Rebecca needs rest." Blackwood nodded, gathering the documents with practiced efficiency. "We have what we need for today. The formal agreements will be drawn up for signing tomorrow." As the meeting dispersed, Diane lingered, waiting until the attorneys had filed out before approaching me. Up close, I could see fine lines of strain around her eyes that her expensive makeup couldn't quite conceal. "You could have destroyed me today," she said quietly. "Why didn't you?" "That was never what this was about," I replied, gathering my strength to stand. "Uncle Richard believed in redemption, not retribution. He loved you, Diane, even knowing what you'd done." "And you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "After everything?" I met her gaze steadily. "You're my sister. That hasn't changed, even if everything else has." Something like hope flickered in her eyes, quickly hidden behind the familiar mask of composure, but I'd seen it, a glimpse of the Diane who might yet exist beneath the layers of ambition and deceit. "The rehabilitation program starts next month," I said, gathering my purse with shaking hands. Uncle Richard arranged everything: housing near the foundation offices, a structured schedule, qualified mentors. "You really believe this will work?" There was genuine curiosity in her question, not just skepticism. "I believe Uncle Richard wouldn't have suggested it if he didn't think it was possible," I replied honestly. "The rest is up to you." Sam appeared at my side, her steady presence a silent reminder that I'd pushed my body to its limits. "Car's waiting," she said, eyeing Diane warily. "We should go." As we turned to leave, Diane called after me, "Becca?" I paused, looking back over my shoulder. "I'm sorry about the funeral. You should have been there." It wasn't a comprehensive apology, nowhere near addressing the full scope of her betrayal, but it was something. A starting point, perhaps. "There will be a memorial service next month," I said. "Uncle Richard's actual friends, not just business associates. You can come if you want." She nodded once, a jerky motion that betrayed more emotion than she probably intended. "I'd like that." Outside, the autumn afternoon was fading toward evening, golden light slanting through the trees that lined Millfield's main street. Sam guided me carefully to her car, hovering as if expecting me to collapse at any moment. "Are you okay?" she asked once we were inside, the question encompassing far more than just my physical condition. I leaned back against the headrest, feeling the weight of the day, of the past week, settling into my bones. "I'm not sure," I answered truthfully, "but I think I will be." As we drove away from the office building, I glanced in the side mirror and saw Diane standing alone on the steps, a solitary figure watching us depart. For just a moment I saw her not as the polished, ruthless businesswoman she'd become, but as the big sister who had once held my hand on the first day of school, whispering courage when I was too frightened to let go. Whether that sister still existed beneath the years of ambition and resentment remained to be seen. The path Uncle Richard had laid out offered a possibility, not a guarantee. Rehabilitation, like healing, would take time and commitment. But for the first time since waking in that hospital room to news of his death, I felt something like peace. Uncle Richard had entrusted me with more than just his material legacy. He'd entrusted me with the harder, more valuable task of reclaiming our family, not through punishment, but through the more difficult path of accountability and potential reconciliation. It was a burden and a gift, wrapped together in the wisdom of a man who had understood both justice and mercy. As Sam's car turned onto the road leading back to town, I touched the small velvet pouch in my purse, feeling the outline of my grandmother's sapphire pendant within. Some inheritances couldn't be measured in dollar amounts or property deeds. The true legacy Uncle Richard had left me was the strength he'd always believed I possessed, to face difficult truths, to stand firm in the face of betrayal, and to choose the harder path of potential healing over the simpler satisfaction of revenge. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, recovery, restoration, rebuilding what had been broken. But today, in this moment, I had honored the trust placed in me, and somehow I knew that Uncle Richard was smiling. 6 months passed like the turning of seasons, winter yielding reluctantly to spring. The Victorian on Willow Creek Road stood, proud against the backdrop of flowering dogwoods, its windows gleaming in the April sunshine. From my seat on the wraparound porch, rocking gently with a book in my lap, I watched as the gardeners restored Uncle Richard's beloved rose garden to its former glory. Recovery had been slower than I'd anticipated. The surgical infection had flared again after the confrontation with Diane, landing me back in the hospital for another week. Dr. Matthews had been professional enough not to say, "I told you so," but her pointed looks during rounds conveyed the message clearly enough. By Christmas, my physical strength had returned, though sometimes I still felt phantom pains where the surgical scar marked my abdomen. The emotional healing took longer, grief for Uncle Richard, mingling with the complicated process of rebuilding a relationship with my sister. Diane had surprised everyone, perhaps even herself, by embracing the rehabilitation program with unexpected commitment. The 5-year plan Uncle Richard had designed was rigorous. Daily counseling, financial ethics training, and supervised work at the Caldwell Foundation. She'd moved into a modest apartment near the foundation offices, surrendered her designer wardrobe for simple business attire, and accepted the strict spending limitations imposed by the trust. "She's actually good at this," Eliza Morgan, the foundation's director, had told me during our monthly update. "She's redesigned our entire affordable housing initiative. The efficiency improvements alone have increased our capacity by 30%. I wasn't naive enough to believe transformation happened overnight. There were still moments when the old Diane surfaced, sharp comments, flashes of entitlement, impatience with the program's restrictions. But there were other moments too, glimpses of something new emerging from the crucible Uncle Richard had designed. The legal consequences for Martin Harrison had been swift and severe. Disbarment proceedings were underway, and the district attorney had filed criminal charges for his role in the embezzlement scheme. Palmer and Winters had distanced themselves completely, providing evidence that Harrison had concealed his actions from the senior partners. "Rebecca," Sam's voice called from inside the house, "the caterers have questions about the setup. Today marked 6 months since Uncle Richard's passing, the memorial gathering I'd promised to host in his honor. Not the formal funeral Diane had arranged while I was unconscious, but a true celebration of his life with the people who had actually known and loved him." "Coming," I called back, setting aside my book and rising from the rocker. Inside, the house hummed with activity. Florists arranged spring blooms in Uncle Richard's favorite spaces, caterers prepared his beloved recipes, and staff from the Caldwell Foundation hung photos chronicling his life's work. I'd moved into the Victorian 3 months ago, after the legal transitions were complete and the house had been thoroughly renovated, not to erase Uncle Richard's presence, but to honor it with fresh paint and repaired floorboards he'd always meant to fix. Sam directed operations with cheerful efficiency, having taken a leave from the bookstore to help me establish the Richard Caldwell Literary Foundation, a new initiative supporting small independent bookshops and literacy programs throughout the state. The original Horizon Books now served as our pilot location, with expanded community spaces and reading programs for underserved children. "Diane just called," Sam said, falling into step beside me as we headed toward the kitchen. "She's running. About 20 minutes late. Something about a foundation meeting that ran over." "That's fine," I replied, surprised by how much I meant it. These small normalcies, Diane calling rather than simply not showing up, explaining her delay, actually planning to attend, represented a shift in our relationship that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. The guests began arriving at 3, filling the house with conversation and laughter that chased away the last lingering shadows of all that had happened here. Uncle Richard's colleagues, old friends from university, neighbors who'd known him for decades, they brought stories I'd never heard, perspectives on the man who had shaped my life in ways I was only beginning to understand. Diane arrived as promised, 22 minutes late, but present. She looked different, her designer clothes replaced with a simple blue dress, her once elaborate hairstyle now a practical shoulder-length cut. But the most noticeable change was in her eyes, which held a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "The house looks beautiful," she said after a slightly awkward greeting. "You've kept all his favorite things." "It seemed important," I replied, leading her into the library, where we would have a moment of privacy before rejoining the guests. "He loved this place." She nodded, trailing her fingers over the spines of books on the nearest shelf. "I used to think it was just about the property value, the Caldwell legacy as a financial asset." A small, self-deprecating smile crossed her face. "I was missing the point entirely." "We all miss things sometimes," I said carefully. "The important part is learning to see them eventually." Our conversation was interrupted by Blackwood, who appeared in the doorway with 2 flutes of champagne. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, his eyes taking in our proximity with approval. "I thought you might like these for the toast we're about to make." We accepted the glasses and followed him back to the great hall, where guests had gathered. Around a large portrait of Uncle Richard, not the formal oil painting that had hung there previously, but a candid photograph I'd found in his personal albums. In it, he stood knee-deep in the lake at his summer cottage, fishing rod in one hand, the other shading his eyes as he laughed at something beyond the frame. It captured his essence in a way no posed portrait ever could. As Blackwood raised his glass to begin the toast, Diane leaned close to whisper, "I had it all wrong, you know, about what mattered to him." "What do you think mattered most?" I asked quietly. She considered for a moment, her gaze moving from the photograph to the diverse crowd gathered in his honor, then finally coming to rest on me. connection, community, leaving the world better than he found it. She hesitated, then added with newfound humility, "Things I'm just beginning to understand." To Richard Caldwell, Blackwood's voice rang out, "Who knew that true wealth is measured, not in possessions, but in the lives we touch and the legacy of kindness we leave behind?" To Uncle Richard, Diane and I echoed together, our glasses touching lightly in the first truly unified moment we'd shared in years. As conversations resumed around us, I looked out at this gathering, not of mourners, but of people celebrating a life well lived, and felt a sense of rightness settle over me. The path forward wouldn't be simple or straight. Diane's rehabilitation would have setbacks, the foundation would face challenges, and there would be days when grief would return unexpectedly sharp. But standing in the home that had sheltered generations of Caldwells, surrounded by the legacy Uncle Richard had entrusted to me, I knew with certainty that we were moving in the right direction. Not toward forgetting the past, but toward building something new from its lessons, just as Uncle Richard had always believed we could. 2 years to the day after Uncle Richard's passing, I stood at the edge of Lake George, watching as the first families received keys to their new homes. Not Diane's luxury lakefront mansions, but something far more meaningful. The Caldwell community, an innovative mixed-income housing development built on land that had once been intended for millionaires. "Ms. Caldwell, would you like to say a few words?" The Foundation's media coordinator gestured toward the small podium where a ribbon-cutting ceremony was about to begin. I nodded, suddenly nervous as I approached the microphone. Public speaking had always been Diane's domain, not mine, but some roles couldn't be delegated. When my Uncle Richard Caldwell looked at this land, I began, scanning the crowd of new homeowners, local officials, and foundation staff. He didn't see dollar signs or investment opportunities. He saw possibilities for community, for belonging, for creating spaces where people could build better lives. From the front row, Sam gave me an encouraging thumbs up. Beside her sat Blackwood, now semi-retired, but still serving as a trustee for the Caldwell Foundation. And at the end of the row, her posture straight and attentive, was Diane. She looked different now, the polished corporate facade replaced by something more authentic. Her hair had grown out to its natural color, with threads of silver she no longer bothered to hide. The expensive designer clothes had given way to practical business attire. But the most profound change was in her eyes, clearer, more focused, without the restless hunger that had driven her for so long. "This project represents everything the Caldwell Foundation stands for," I continued. "Sustainable development, economic diversity, and the belief that everyone deserves a place to call home." I gestured to the cluster of attractive townhomes and apartments nestled among preserved trees. "But I can't take credit for the vision you see before you. That belongs to our foundation's housing director, who transformed an initial concept into something truly extraordinary." I extended my hand toward Diane. "I'd like to invite Diane Caldwell to share more about the community she's helped create." The surprise on my sister's face was genuine. This hadn't been in the program. She hesitated for just a moment before rising and joining me at the podium. As we exchanged places, our hands briefly touched, a small contact that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. Diane adjusted the microphone with the confidence of someone accustomed to public speaking. But when she looked out at the gathered families, something in her expression softened. "Thank you, Rebecca," she began, her voice steady. "When I joined the Caldwell Foundation, it wasn't entirely by choice." A knowing chuckle rippled through those familiar with her story, which had become something of a redemption narrative in philanthropic circles. "But what began as an obligation has become the most rewarding work of my life." As she outlined the features of the development, the sustainable energy systems, the shared community spaces, the educational facilities, I studied her with wonder. The transformation wasn't magical or complete. There were still moments of tension between us, disagreements about foundation priorities, occasional flashes of the old Diane. But the vindictive, calculating sister who had once stolen my inheritance while I lay unconscious in a hospital bed was gone, replaced by someone I was slowly learning to trust again. After the ceremony, as the new residents explored their homes and foundation staff mingled with community partners, Diane and I found ourselves alone by the lakeshore, watching the late afternoon sun cast golden light across the water. "Uncle Richard would have loved this," I said, breaking our comfortable silence. Diane nodded, her eyes on the distant mountains. "I used to think he was fighting me out of stubbornness, that he couldn't see the potential of this property." She picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water's surface. "Turns out he saw something better than I did. He saw the best in both of us," I replied, "even when we couldn't see it in ourselves or each other." "Well, he was right about you," Diane said, glancing at me sidelong. "You've managed the foundation brilliantly. The literary initiative, the environmental grants, this development, you've expanded his vision in ways I never imagined." The compliment caught me off guard. "I couldn't have done the housing component without you," I said honestly. "Your business experience, your attention to detail, they've been invaluable." She smiled slightly. "Redirected skills, that's what my therapist calls it." We fell silent again, watching a family of ducks glide across the lake's surface. The court-mandated counseling had ended 6 months ago, but Diane had chosen to continue the sessions, another surprise in a season of them. "I've been thinking," she said finally. "The 5-year supervision period ends next spring. I'll have fulfilled all the requirements of the agreement." My heart sank a little. Despite our complicated history, I'd grown accustomed to having Diane in my life again, not as a rival, but as a cautious ally in continuing Uncle Richard's work. "Have you decided what you'll do after?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She turned to face me directly, her expression earnest in a way the old Diane would have considered a weakness. "I'd like to stay on, if you'll have me. Not because of a court order or a rehabilitation program, but because this work matters." She gestured toward the new homes where families were gathering on porches, children racing across green spaces. "Because I'm good at it, and because somewhere along the way I started to care. Relief and something like joy washed over me." "The foundation needs you," I said. Then, more softly, "I've gotten used to having my sister back." Diane's smile was tentative but real. "I've got a lot to make up for. We've got a lot to build together," I corrected her. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the landscape Uncle Richard had fought to protect, I felt his presence more strongly than I had since his passing, not as a ghost or a supernatural force, but as the culmination of the values he'd lived by and the legacy he'd entrusted to us. Uncle Richard had faced a choice when he discovered Diane's betrayal. He could have simply cut her out, reported her crimes, watched her face public humiliation and imprisonment. Instead, he'd created a pathway to redemption. Difficult, demanding, but possible. He'd believed that healing, even from the deepest wounds, could happen if the conditions were right. Standing beside my sister as darkness fell over Lake George, watching lights come on in windows of homes that would shelter families for generations, I knew Uncle Richard had left us the greatest inheritance of all, the chance to become our better selves, and that was a legacy worth more than any fortune could measure.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.